Today I had a conversation with Andrew Marino. He's a biophysicist and attorney who spent 50 years studying electromagnetism and its impact on life. He also has the best first-hand account of working and spending many years with Robert Becker. And there's not a whole lot of information as far as video and audio goes about Andrew Marino's life's work or Robert Becker's. They both have a combination of many books, but my favorite book that I read by Andrew was Going Somewhere, A Life in Science. And I want to keep the introduction short because there was so much said in this podcast, it pretty much captures all of it. Andrew is a really genuine human being with high integrity, and I really just feel honored to have him on the show to preserve some of his essence and his life's work. And I'm really looking forward to his last book that he's written. I think it'll be his 7th book. And he has more peer-reviewed papers published in his field than any other scientist alive. So enjoy this episode, and don't forget to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and it's on Rumble now.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right. Well, Andrew Marino, thank you for joining me today. It's really an honor to have you here.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, we had to record on Zoom because we had some tech issues, but who cares, right?
Right.
Well, awesome. I've really been loving your work, and I really look up to you, and I think this is a very important conversation, and you're a person that I think needs to be captured and shared with as many people as possible because of the nature of your work. You've spent over 50 years in this field, and I think you're the most qualified person with the most published papers in this field. So I think it's going to be really nice to share your story and your ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I started reading Robert Becker's work, and I was curious if you wanted to first give a little introduction to who you are, a little bit of your credentials, and how you got connected with him and spent so many years with him.
I got an undergraduate degree in physics in 1962 and went into industry and for a year and a half was having a pretty good time working on really neat projects, submarines that could fire ballistic missiles, laser distance measuring, magnetohydrodynamic projects for generating electrical power, and enjoyed it. But I was dissatisfied with my role. I was just basically a data taker. The guys who had the PhDs were having the fun. They were calling the shots, and I wanted to call shots. So I went back to school and studied enrolled in a physics program to get a PhD in physics. And in my first year, after I got there, I was at the end of that first year, graduate students have to pick a specialty they want to go into. And the specialties available at Syracuse University at that time didn't seem worthy of a person spending his life studying general relativity. I mean, pretty neat, but at the end of the day, how does that help humanity? And I wanted to do something worthwhile. The other group of physics professors who were taking graduate students were studying what's called high energy physics. And that's where you study the particles that make up the particles that make up atoms. That's pretty cool. But I couldn't see how that was going to benefit people, at least my definition of benefit. Then I found one professor there who was interested in a really obscure subject in physics called biophysics. And that was really an emphasis was on the physics. It was applying physics to biology. So you only brought methodology into biology. You didn't bring anything more than that. But anyway, it was closer to something I thought was neat. And I began working in his laboratory for a couple of months. He, it turned out, was a friend with an orthopedic surgeon who worked across the street from the physics department in the Veterans Administration Hospital, a guy named Robert Becker. Now, Robert Becker was he was on a toot. He was doing well. He was publishing papers that were blowing people away. and they had to do with the role, if you can believe it, physics in healing. He wanted to know, how does healing go about? You break a bone, and the bone starts healing. What makes it start? And then when it does the healing, what controls it? And then what stops the process? And then what remodels the bone that grew so that when you look at the injury site 6 months later, you can't ever tell there was an injury. Remarkable. And he was using ideas about physics to explore the mechanism to control that. And he had gone to the physics department and got my mentor involved. And one of Becker's achievements was an NIH grant. It was a big deal. A lot of money, a lot of fame. He was looking for a physicist, first year graduate student, to work on the project. And my mentor sent a bunch of his graduate students over to interview. And I was one of them. And my interview went great. I mean, he was telling me about his research doing regeneration. He would he would amputate a limb in a salamander, and the salamander would grow a whole new limb. But if you amputated a limb in a frog, which is one click above phylogenetically a salamander, it doesn't regenerate a limb. And anything above it, including humans, don't regenerate limbs. Why? So he's doing some experiments, and he tells me that he's able to partially regenerate a limb in animals that don't normally regenerate, like the frog. And then we talked. He liked the cut of my jib. I certainly was impressed by him. And during the interview, he said to me, "Would you like the job?" Job. But by the time the air molecules were carrying the word job hit my ear, sure I wanted it, and I took the job. And I worked there, got my PhD, doing work that came out of his mind, but it allowed me the freedom to do an enormous amount. And then I stayed on 14 years after I got the PhD, until politics intervened and they forced him into retirement. During that time, I had the best job that existed in the world at that time, in my opinion. And then it led to, by the way, a job over the next 30 years that was the best job in the world that existed during that 30-year period. When that was all over, I retired.
That's amazing. That's a real good, quick overview of all of it. But man, there's so much to get into, and I'd love to hear this story. I loved your book, Going Somewhere. It was really, I think, one of the most important books that I've ever read to understand the nature of the problem that we're dealing with here with the corruption of big industries and the ethics removal from the scientific community. It seems like that's what you have a better lens into than anyone I've ever heard of. So I'd love to know a little bit more about your time with Becker, because he seems to be a very important person to you, obviously, and important person to humanity as a whole, and hear a little bit more about how he got hung up by going after these big tech companies once he realized the electric grid was going in and calling them out.
Well, I put the whole story together in a book, and everything I want to say about him, and which I'm going to briefly mention now, is in that book. In the book, I acknowledge, in my judgment, he was one of the most significant scientists of the 20th century. Why? Because he thought outside the box. Early on, he made the point to me that there had to be something more than biochemistry to explain life. Biochemistry is just chemical reactions in a beaker or in a bag called a cell, just chemical reactions. There's got to be more than that to explain life. And that's absolutely correct. I don't think anybody argues with that. They just don't explore it. They stay with the comfortable little biochemical studies. And his idea and his advice to me was that biochemistry really no more than stamp collecting. I mean, if healing occurs and life exists, there's obviously a biochemical basis, but how does it work? What controls it? That's the thing he went after, and that's why he brought me into the laboratory. And he had some theories about how it might work. And in my initial years, I followed his conception, his speculation, his hypotheses regarding those mechanisms. After several years, while I was still a graduate student, I had the unfortunate responsibility to tell him that some of his pet hypotheses, the ones he brought me in there, cannot be sustained. They violate physical laws, and there's no evidence that I can find to support them. So let's go along this path in order to pursue the basic goal, which was to understand growth regulation, to actually understand life. Understand life. What makes life? Nobody knows. Nobody's tried to understand it. Physics gave up on it at the time of Schrödinger 75 years ago. And there's been no studies within the physics establishment ever since then. They just don't do it. They don't have the tools to do it. It's the reason they don't do it. Because life is different than its properties are different than the properties of inanimate matter. We can come back to this later. At any rate, I now had my head. He brought in the money with grants. I didn't have to worry about writing grants. We published in all the famous journals of the world over a period of several years. Had a hell of a good time. Made a lot of progress, and the gist of what we found was that electromagnetic energy has biological effects. And by electromagnetic energy, I mean very, very, very low levels of electromagnetic energy that occur naturally, but the levels that we're talking about are far lower than the levels that occur naturally. And since we had already found evidence that the natural levels can affect the body, can control biological activity, it's also a separate story, but we had found it out. Everybody had found it out. Since that was known, I began to speculate about the possible health risks of man-made electromagnetic energy. If the stuff is active and you're putting it into the environment and not checking to see whether it was safe or not, is that a wise thing? I wasn't predicting it cause cancer or anything else. I was just identifying it as a biologically active entity that ought to be pursued. Well, that opened Pandora's box. It elevated Becker into a high status within the federal government in terms of an advisor, because there's much going on at the federal level that we knew nothing about. He learned about because he was taken into their confidence. He said nothing to me about it. And the only reason I knew he had been taken into their confidence is because I saw these squirrely guys with thick glasses that looked exactly like what friends of mine called spooks coming and going from his office. So I put two and two together and figured he was communing with federal representatives. They were really concerned about the consequences of man-made electromagnetic energy. But it prompted him to accept my pleas to allow me to use the resources he brought in to do studies of simulated electromagnetic energy exposures in the environment. The thing I settled on, the easiest thing and the cheapest, was using rats and mice to study the effects of low-frequency electromagnetic energy, the kind of stuff that leaks off high-voltage power lines, and it surrounds electric blankets. And I started exposing animals to those simulated fields. I built equipment to simulate exposure, human exposure in the laboratory. And lo and behold, in controlled experiments, I found effects. and you need to understand what a controlled experiment is. Two groups of rats, exposed and not exposed. In both, you measure something and you ask whether that thing that was measured was affected by the presence of the energy. If it was, you have an effect. If you have an effect, you've raised the possibility of a health risk if you similarly expose humans, because human physiology, more or less, is similar to animal physiology. Or let's put it this way. It's the best way we could study the effects on humans, because it's immoral and illegal and incredibly dangerous to directly expose human beings to this environment. So I did those experiments, started publishing them, and the government's interest in consulting Becker as an advisor skyrocketed, and industry antagonism toward Becker also skyrocketed. They didn't like him at all. He was just plain bad for their reputation. There was not a problem they wanted, but he gave me the authority to continue. He was my cover. And I think even as early as 1972, 1973, he knew his career was going to be short if he did that. But he did it.
It's amazing.
I would live long enough to fight on another hill. He wouldn't. And the upshot was he got killed. They made him retire 7 years later when he was 56 years old. One of the brightest scientists of the century was forced to retire. That pissed me off.
Yeah.
And that's when my life became dedicated to doing what I could do to keep alive his ideas and go as far as I could go. And that's what I did.
How long did he stay alive after he retired, and was he in your world of giving you consulting or at least being involved?
He died in 2008, which was 20. He retired in 1980. He retired in 2008. During that period of time, he had a hard time. He would not be touched by anybody from industry in the health risk aspect, but he had developed methods for using electromagnetic energy for treating disease, and there were one or two companies who invested in his ideas and who used him as a consultant. So for about 10 years. That work limped along, but he was far, far, far from being a businessman. And I don't know to what extent your knowledge of biomedical the development and entrepreneurship, the way it works and how it eats up the inventors, but it does, and it ate him up. So 10 years later, he was out of it altogether, not doing anything. He was emasculated, is what it amounted to, which just added more to my resolution of pursuing his ideas, regardless of the consequences, except for my need to earn a living to support my family. I couldn't drive my family, well, by this time I had a wife and 4 children, I couldn't drive them into poverty. So I skirted around the edges, did what I could, and then happened to find, as I said, the second best job that existed in the world between 1980 and 2010.
That's amazing. So what happened to him really did give you fuel and meaning and purpose to keep going forward and to fight these monsters that sort of took over the scientific endeavor. And
it was my motivation. It was my muse. But the muse was to not fight anybody in particular except ignorance. I wanted to demonstrate that, first of all, that the effects we found were real. Industry went bizarre. They went bonkers, spent tens of millions of dollars to falsify our research, and failed. But they created a lot of negative publicity and didn't make my life any easier. They created theories that purported to show that physics denied there could be an effect. I spent years doing physics research to demonstrate that physics didn't deny the effects. It posited it. And I proposed a mechanism. I demonstrated a mechanism under the laws of physics that could account for the effects. So I was trying to do something positive, not to go after those guys and emasculate them. I wanted to do something that would have a permanent existence, not just a war of guys bitching at one another. And that's why, and my job gave me the opportunity to do that. That's why it was the best job in that time frame. And I did it.
Yeah.
And when I did it, I finished it. I went as far as I could go. I retired.
And while you were working with Becker, you went to law school. And can you talk a little bit about that and why you made that choice?
After I got my PhD, I had one son, moved to the country, and there was a stone quarry not too far from the house I bought. And it was setting off explosions. It would knock my son, who by that point was a year old, it would knock him out of his crib, and it would create dust pollution in the atmosphere, where the air we were breathing and he was breathing, and it would send these huge trucks down our street. And my kids in the front yard, the stones would bounce off the the backs of those trucks and bounce back and hit my kids' stroller. I mean, it was making life miserable. So I complained to the local authorities about what I regarded as immoral, improper, and illegal activity of the stone quarry. So the authorities, I don't know why I expected them to listen to me rather than to this huge tax-paying company that I was complaining about. But I was naive and thought that they would listen. And they did listen to an extent. They had a hearing. And at the hearing, they made me sit in the back and forbade me from talking, but allowed the industry, the stone industry, to bring in experts. They brought in an expert from South Carolina who testified under oath that the sound produced by the mining activities at the levels on my property were less than the levels of chirping birds. That was the testimony in court. That all of the trucks were properly designed to not allow stones to bounce off the back of the payload. So therefore, they didn't happen. And that the air pollution that I complained about was absolutely non-existent. They went on my property and measured the air, and it was clear and clean and sweet and perfect. I'm sitting there. I can't believe this is happening, using science this way. I stood up, and I didn't know what the rules were. I didn't know how to proceed. All I did was complain bitterly. I forget the language, but at the end, I remember what I said. That tyranny is not dead. It's alive and well in Skinny Atlas, New York. And as I said that, I could see that the guy who was presiding was going like this to a cop in the back, pointing for him to come up and grab me by the scruff of the neck and throw me out of the meeting.
Wow.
That night, I swore I was never going to be done in by myself, but done in because I didn't know the rules. 2 months later, I was in law school. I was going to learn the rules of the world. It took me 4 years to finish. Normally it takes 3 years. It took me 4 because I was still working full-time in Dr. Becker's lab. But I got through it, got the degree, and just to put the capstone on it, passed the New York bar to show that I was a real lawyer. I never practiced law in any significant sense of that meaning and that word, but I was a lawyer. And I knew the rules, and I knew how to protect myself, and I knew how not short-circuit myself. That's the reason I went to law school.
It's a perfect combination for someone in your shoes with that situation that unfolded to then go forth and start to really understand how to fight these big tech companies, especially in the landscape that was unfolding then. So,
how many people in 1972 had a job that allowed them to go to law school, that had a law school right across the street from where they worked, and had a boss who was willing to rearrange my work hours in his laboratory, because I was a federal employee working in the VA hospital. I was a federal employee using money that came from grants that he got both from the federal government through NIH and through his status at the VA. His research at the VA made him a national figure. He was well known, and he was generating enormously great positive publicity for the VA and the VA research program, because he was promising to his research held promise to regenerate limbs. Orthopedic surgeons want to do that to understand why human beings are presently not regenerating limbs, which meant studying neurophysiology. He had the ability to do that. He had the resources to do that. And he authorized me to begin doing that. Research that I carried on later on after I moved to my next job, but began under him. But he was doing these studies. He was making nerve measurements of the neural system. He found out that the electrical signals that can be measured on the body of a living thing, if I took a voltmeter and started measuring the voltage on your elbow, I would measure a voltage. And there's another one on your shoulder, another one on the tip of your nose, and another one on every part of your body. And that's true on the surface of any living organism. Not on non-living organisms, but on living organisms. Why? Because there are electrical control systems within the body regulating life, regulating growth, regulating healing, and those systems result in signals on the surface. I measured those signals after learning from him how to do it. He was doing it, and when he did it, he learned that the pattern of amplitude of these voltages matched the pattern of nerves that existed in the body. I won't go into the detail, but the results made stupendous headlines in science in the early 60s, mid 60s, up until 67, 68. He was doing great things for publicity of the research program at the VA. So he had a lot of VA dollars, some of which he let me spend.
that's amazing. He seems like one of the best scientists that ever lived, and then you got to spend so much time with him.
You know, well, spending time with him was the greatest joy of my life. Whether he's the best scientist, like many of the words that we're going to have to be careful about and define, is what you mean by a best scientist. To me, a best scientist is a guy who wants to understand and study. He's got the cojones to study problems that are important to human beings and that other human beings won't study, and who develops physically justifiable theories. Doesn't suck them out of the thumb, but physically justifiable theories to explain these uh, uh, biological phenomena. It takes a lot of guts to do that. It's dangerous. Journals don't want to publish your papers because they think it's too wild. Grant organizations don't want to give you money because they think it's too speculative. It's a dangerous thing to do, to be novel in the world in which you function. That's why he was great. Secondly, he was great is because he had these tested. Besides having the cojones to go ahead, he had the ideas to back them up. So he was great at two levels. Really great at the first level, and only partially great at the second level, because just as you might expect and should expect, some of his ideas were sustainable and some weren't. His idea that electrons can move through biological tissue was not sustainable. His idea that electromagnetic signals in the environment can affect biological phenomena and stimulate disease was justifiable. That's where we chose to fight, and that's where he lost. Yeah. That's why he got kicked out.
So as soon as he started to realize that these EMFs could cause harm, the signals, the electricity could cause harm, and he started to bring that message forth, that was immediately when he lost his funding and he got his reputation completely tarnished. Is that right?
That's about 90% right. He's not doing the experiments to generate to justify the inference of health risks. And not causing any particular diseases. That's not the studies we're doing. But there's something about this that you should study further, to be honest, and to be reasonable, without using the human beings in the environment as guinea pigs. You have to have evidence to justify that. I did those experiments, not him. He was doing the more. He was, on one hand, advising the federal government about matters that troubled him greatly, which I think maybe we'll talk about later. And he was pursuing clinical applications. I was doing the grunt work with regard to providing evidence to sustain the hypothesis of a health risk. And before I started that, I began experiments trying to justify the physical theory he had for how it worked. I contradicted it. I showed that it couldn't work. And then I showed that what he thought was biological evidence that it did work was an improperly done experiment. He didn't like that either. But he still allowed me to publish it, made contributions to the final paper, and the paper that negates one of his prime theories, he's an author of. Human beings don't normally do that. They don't fess up to making mistakes and sign the paper that indicates that they made a mistake. That's what makes the man great.
Yeah.
He tells the truth as best he knows. He didn't like either one of those two things, but the evidence was the evidence, and he trusted me to not be double-crossing him. That's why he was great. But he's now functioning at a higher level, and I'm functioning at the down in the trenches, and it would have continued that way, except that the high voltage power line issue started in 1973, and once he gave me my own head on that, it was absolutely clear that his days were numbered, and they actually would have ended in 76, except that he used his influence within the Veterans Administration and his connection with some important senators to keep our lab going for one more cycle of a grant, 3 more years, to 1979. Mm-hmm. But he told me in 1976, Marino, this is the end of the road. By 1979, you're going to be working somewhere else. What happened?
That's amazing. Yeah, that's actually why I really wanted to talk to you because both of you have high integrity and you've kept the actual essence of what science is to pursue truth regarding what the nature of reality actually is. Doesn't matter if it lines up with what you want or if it's going to make profit. And a lot of these companies, once it started to unfold, it seems like now we're in an exponential technological landscape where people are just able to go and deploy the technology into the masses and into the planet. And now we're living in a world of pure guinea pig science, where they're using human beings in the medical models, in the electromagnetic models. All the models are just basically tested out first, and then the little guy, the David and Goliath story, which is who you were in the story, it sounds like, have to go and prove that this is all causing harm to human beings. And they make it
Well,
almost impossible to do with the amount of money they have. And
you covered um, you covered many issues in what you just said, and my caveat regarding what you just said is that there are qualifications, explanations, issues that are buried in what you just said that need to be explored and understood if there's ever to be progress. And I want to go back to the very first thing you said as an example of the caveat I'm trying to express now. Truth. Now, what that word means or has been understood to mean has got to be clarified. There is no truth in the world, in my mind. If the word truth is taken to mean some highfalutin, esoteric concept that you read about in the books of philosophy, what exists in the world that you live in and I live in is what I call the concept of the best version of truth, the best you can do. If you start thinking about it as being any more certain than that, you fall into an aporia. You're done. You're dead. You're going nowhere. You're wasting my time, and I don't want to talk to you. That's my attitude toward people who do that. What we're interested in is the best version of the truth that we can get. And we have to take into consideration how much money we want to spend in pursuing that best version. Those are complicated questions that I don't want to gainsay and I don't want to brush over. I don't want to hide. I want to get them out front. So when we talk about truth, when I talk about truth, I want it understood that I'm talking about the best version of truth that is proper and probably affordable if the public was given a vote in whether they wanted that level. Right now, they have no vote at all. All of the decisions are made behind closed doors, pursuant to the ambitions, desires, and authority and control of industry. There is no public input in any meaningful way to the level of safety we want in the environment. The public just goes along in this day and age, blind, fat, and happy that the government has a safe level for exposure to chemical X or electromagnetic energy Y. They've got a safe level exposure. That's just plain bullshit. What they have is an economically acceptable to industry level of exposure. To call it safe is not correct. Let me put it that way.
yeah.
That's the world we live in.
Yeah, I'd love to keep unpacking a lot of this stuff, and we will but in your book, Going Somewhere, you get into how and why this industry was able to capture science and how they got so far off course in some of the issues there.
Listen, two obvious answers. They were able to do it because they had money, and they didn't get off on course. They got exactly on course they wanted to be. They wanted to use their money to accomplish their goals. Their goals are public acceptance of their product and profit, and that's what they did. You know, there are regulatory agencies that set exposure limits. Now, these regulatory agencies started out as representing just the public. The public then was conceived of as people who were exposed, the guinea pigs. Then very quickly, the definition of public was recalibrated by the lobbying efforts of industry to mean everybody, including industry. So you see now, within government, you've got this Trojan horse. You've got the need for federal regulatory agencies to keep in mind not just the health of the public, but the economic benefit accruing to industry, which industry was quick to point out translates directly into the well-being of the public. Because if industry doesn't do well, the public's, namely the job workers, don't do well. So you see how complicated it became when the constituency of the regulatory agencies became defined in 1971, 1972.
And then they start to get their hands inside of the institutions of education, right? And they start to really become an indoctrination model of this centralized system.
Well, listen, it's the same story. They had money. Now today, if you're a biology professor at Harvard, physics professor at Yale, or a physiological biochemistry professor at Duke, you want to keep your job, you better go get government grants or industry grants. Either one. Just bring in money to this institution, because every grant that comes to the institution, irrespective of whether it comes from the government or industry, pays a thing called overhead. So if I write a grant request for $1 million, the grant request from Harvard, let's say I was on the faculty at Harvard, and when I wrote that grant request, and I asked for $1 million, the grant request would go to the potential grantor of $2.4 million, of which I, as the chief investigator, would control the $1 million I asked for, how I could spend it. The institution would get the $1.4 million for it to spend for its overhead, for keeping me on the faculty.
Right.
These universities, Duke, Yale, Harvard, MIT, all 15 of the top big ones, and then very soon another 85 of the less big ones, wouldn't hire a professor unless he had this grant or was likely to get that grant. And so you can see those interests, that money, captured the whole academic structure of the country.
Yeah.
Straightforward.
Yep.
Unambiguous.
It's really a terrible situation. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think that it could ever be uncoupled at this point, or how you could get it back on the rails. But if you have a thought on that.
It can't. And it can't happen. That's the reason I'm writing the book now about Philip Handler, who's the guy, in my judgment, primarily responsible for this thing going so bad, for science going so bad. But only if his role in doing it, which will highlight the fact that it was done. Since it was done, no one can see it. It's like the emperor with new clothes.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks he's got clothes on, and the people don't realize he has clothes. It's an illusion. People don't see it. They think that science is honest, that it's unbiased, that it seeks the public interest, that it's ethical, that it's moral, that it's a special form of human enterprise, that it's really cool, keen, neat, and wonderful, which was I might say, the attitude the public had in 1950s and 1960s. Handler killed it. By 1970s, it was dead. Can you imagine today's social environment, trying to go online and convince the people in the social media that science really cared about its interests, that science existed really for the benefit of humanity? You'd be trolled out of existence. It's absurd, and no one has that idea now. Back then, when people talked about the National Academy of Sciences, of which Handler was the president, they would use the word prestige as if it was in the title. They would say, "Oh, the prestigious National Academy of Sciences," as if it was part of the title. That was the attitude people had. Nobody has that attitude today about the Academy or any other science-linked organization. They are looked upon as no more moral, no more ethical, at best, than is politics or business. Why would you expect science to be more ethical than them? Makes no sense in today's world, the way people think.
Right.
I think they got a point, because there's nothing special about scientists. So why would you expect them to be better human beings? And the reason Handler said they were was because they invented the laws of physics. But inventing the laws of physics was child's play compared to discovering the laws of biology. Not a single law of biology is known. Every law of physics is known. Every behavior that exists in the inanimate world today, with exceptions that are so trivial that I won't pause to discuss. With that exception, every phenomenon exhibited in the non-animate world is explainable deductively from equations, by equations bright physicists devised. They were smart son of a guns. Skip to biology. In the world of biology, no law exists, much less is reduced to a mathematical formulation which permits deductive answers and explanations. Nothing is known about biology. Nothing, except what Dr. Becker called stamp collecting. Biochemical information, which must exist. Biochemical information must exist because it happens. And it's not the finger of God that's making the heartbeat. It's some biochemical reactions going on. But that doesn't explain the heartbeat. The heartbeat is a regulatory system which necessarily involves electromagnetic energy, which Handler forbade to be studied, which is the reason why he succeeded in closing Becker's laboratory. Which is what he did.
This seems like the most important piece here that you're talking about, and I'm looking forward to reading that book, but the difference between physics and biology and how that got completely separated and how people started to adopt these belief systems around physics, and how you get people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who are the spokesperson of science today, as the authoritative figure, and they have a lot of arrogance to them when they talk about this subject, as if they're the scientist and that it's the science. So I think this is a really important piece here that I love about you.
That's the reason why I usually don't do interviews, why I keep my shoulder to the grindstone, trying to finish that book so that it survives me. But you asked what prompted that dialogue was your question about what could we do now? And my answer is, I think right now, nothing. Right now, trying to do something would be like trying to lift yourself off the ground by your own bootstraps. It just violates the laws of reality, in this case, physics. in the case we're talking about, the loss of human nature. Human nature not going to allow that to happen. But if human nature comes to an understanding of how we got into this situation, where now the government spends money to cure cancer. It has a law, almost a law, that it will not spend money to understand what causes cancer. If it did, it would piss off a lot of industries. It would create enormous headaches. It would cause ramifications for the economy. Some people would lose their jobs. It would be really terrible. So they don't want to know, because we're going to find out what causes it are the chemicals and energy levels, the anthropogenic levels of both of those entities that we pump into the environment. Those are clearly the major causes, besides cigarette smoking and some really obvious things like sticking like X-rays.
Yeah.
Obvious.
Spraying our food with pesticides.
That's just one of the contaminants in the environment that whose role in causing cancer cannot be studied. It's borders on the illegal to study it. No one in the right mind will undertake to do it. So until we get over that hurdle and understand that the public understands that you're better off if you demand that your tax money be invested in finding causes, not mechanisms, not biochemical, because biochemistry operates at the mechanistic level. Sure, there's got to be a mechanism. There's got to be a biochemical mechanism. That's not the salient question that people are willing, if they understood, would be willing to have their tax money spent. But they don't understand the problem, so they don't make that demand. My hope is to have that understood sometime toward the end of the 21st century. And my book will help. It won't pick it about necessarily, but it certainly won't hurt.
Yeah, well, it's important that you capture all of it and have it out there, especially after all the years of having such a front row seat to the underlying issue here.
The thing that really motivates me is that I'm in a unique position to write that. I know everything that Handler ever said or did, every place he ever worked, everything he ever wrote, every testimony he gave. He testified before Congress more than 100 times in favor of his views. I know all the people he supported. I know the committees he appointed. I know the people on the committees he appointed. I know the work of the people on the committees he appointed. I know the steps he took to bring Becker down. I know all of that. Plus, I know all the biochemistry he knows. I know all of the law he doesn't know. Never knew. I know all the mathematics and the physics that he never knew. And I was in a position to exploit my advantages, and no one else, for almost 50 years, and no one else alive today did that. So I'm keen to get it done before I join eternity.
How far along are you with this book?
Well, I'm finishing the 10th chapter now. I planned 12 chapters. I'm publishing them chapter by chapter, but in a crude way. Before I publish the book, I have to integrate all these chapters better. But I figure that I'm better off publishing the chapters crudely and non-integrated, just in case I get called before I want to go.
Yeah.
But I hope to get chapter 10 out within a few months. And then within a few months after that, chapters 11 and 12 should go carefully, because everything in that chapter involves me personally interacting with Handler at arm's length, but directly. Everything else came from what I learned about him by reading his works, by reading his books, by reading his speeches, by reading his papers, and by interviewing the people who knew him. But it's all indirect. I want to finish all these chapters, then I want to integrate them. Then I'll publish them all integrated. But I'm just publishing them as I go, because that's the best I can do, because God gave me no guarantee for how far I'm going to be able to go.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, I'm grateful for you doing that. And if you need to send over some copies so that I have them just in case, I'll make sure they live on.
Well, the posts are on my website, chapter by chapter as I go.
Okay, cool.
My
Awesome.
next one is going to be chapter 10 within 2 months.
Beautiful. That's great that you're putting them out there and preserving that.
As rough as they are,
Yeah.
they
Oh,
have the gist. They contain. I'm laying the foundation for the terrible things I'm going to tell you about Handler in the chapters I haven't written, which, by the way, I have already described to a great extent in the books I've already written. So there's not going to be much more nasty about Handler that are going to be in the chapters that I'm going to write, except that they're going to be integrated with his background. So you're going to see why and how he did what he did.
mm,
It's really less important than what he did. And what he did to Becker has already been described in 2 books.
wow. Have you ever felt like your life was threatened, or has it been threatened, or Becker's? Did his life get threatened when he started to go forth with this stuff?
No, because I think I'm perceived as once I was cut off from funding, I was viewed as not a threat because how could I do research without funds? But my job provided me with all the funds I needed. I had access to, roughly speaking, throughout my entire career to pursue the leads that Becker provided for me and the development of those leads that I generated in my laboratory, which I had for 40 years. I controlled about $100,000 a year. Now that's not a lot of money by today's standards, given some of the grants that are given today, but it was a lot of money during the time I was functioning,
Hmm.
and more than enough for me to do more than the minimum of what I wanted to do. That's how I got it done.
Yeah. I'd love to learn a little bit and share with the audience. A lot of people have never been exposed to any of these ideas about the effects on biology that the grid has and that the radio stations have and all the EMFs have, the non-native EMFs. So I'd love to hear what you discovered, maybe even describe to people that are not used to hearing about this subject what EMFs are, how they work, the low and high frequency element to it, and what you discovered. And yeah, just go from there.
I'll cooperate with you, of course, but I'm a little, how shall I say, less than sanguine about the interest the public has right now in learning about these things. You just described some testimony by someone who shouldn't have been testifying for the public, advising the public. We have Musk advising the public about science. We have Trump advising the public about science. We have senators from Texas and Florida advising the public. We have the governor of Florida advising the public. Now, how in the world do you expect people on social media to draw a distinction between what they say and what I say? They haven't, for the most part, paid the dues to do what's necessary to understand who is providing the best version of the truth. They haven't learned enough about science to do that. They haven't made enough of an effort to do that. They're just taken to believing what fits their ideology. Listen, that's the world we live in, and I recognize that. So I don't go head to head with those people or make any overt attempt. I don't run away from them. I don't run toward them either. But honestly, how could you expect them to decide that what I'm saying is a closer version of the truth than what the governor of Florida says? How could they know that? They do not have access to something that I have had access to throughout my career. Not enough, but access to the greatest truth-finding vehicle ever invented by human beings. It's called cross-examination. You go on a witness stand and you undergo cross-examination and you want to defend a proposition X, you say it's based on evidence. If you are cross-examined by a halfway confident lawyer, you will have your nuts handed to you. It's a very, very, very powerful tool for finding the truth. Now, if someone makes an assertion of truth and is not held to account for how he knows what he's saying, he is not cross-examined in some reasonable way, he can say anything and does. Witness the governor of Florida and numerous other people. Today, we do not hold in our society people to a level of responsibility for explaining why they believe or profess or defend a certain scientific assertion. That's bad.
Yeah, it seems like a real mess for sure. But you do have that skill set, and you have been in the trenches, and you have seen what these things do to the biology. And I'd love for you to share that truth with people about the fact that these power lines do have repercussions, and so do our smartphones and everything else that we're surrounded by in this electromagnetic soup.
So, someday, when you have the time, we will have a discussion about the cross-examination I wrote and saw carried out of Hermann Schwann. Now, Hermann Schwann is the senior single physicist, scientist that the industry throughout the world relies on as the source of evidence for the safety of constant exposure to the electromagnetic energy from cell phones. Now, I had that sucker under cross-examination, and we took him behind the woodshed and did a job on him. I can give you the documentation. I can tell you the story, but the bottom line is, this guy was completely disgraced. Yet today, the FCC and all European regulatory agencies base their regulatory safety level for exposure on Hermann Schwann's thermal theory. That's the way it is now. Now, if you can't take that down now, you can't take nothing down in this century. Next century, I'm hoping things are going to be better.
And what is the core essence from what I gathered when I read your book was with that theory of the heat that he's measuring versus the change in the electric field on the biology. Is that right? Or something along those lines? It's more about the change that the body would respond to, not just the heat?
A physicist can only talk about mechanisms. The mechanism he's talking about is heat. And every physicist knows heat is always deposited in a body, whether the body is alive or dead. It's always deposited. The laws of physics, a thing called Ohm's law, requires it to be there. Schwann's assertion is that there's no other mechanism that can explain how electromagnetic energy causes a physical effect other than heat, and cell phones can't cause heat, therefore cell phones are safe. Well, the assertion that there's no other mechanism is false. I published a physics description of an alternative mechanism. I didn't prove it existed. I just proved it wasn't alien to the laws of physics. He claimed it was alien to the laws of physics. So I rebutted him. But he claims nothing more than the fact that the laws of physics prohibit any effect. And that's the grossest effort, mistake that a physicist can make is to say that something in biology is impossible. Every physicist who says that is an ass. You should never say that, and is appreciated as an ass, except Schwann. He's not appreciated as an ass, even though that's exactly what he said.
Yeah, and you hear Elon really saying it quite a bit because he's been asked on big platforms about the possibility that cell phones are having a negative impact on the biology, and he blows it off as like it's absolutely not true. They're safe, and he's actually about to put out his own cell phone or his own smartphone very shortly here, which is pretty wild.
He's making two claims. He's making a claim that there's no experimental evidence to indicate that energy at that level can have an effect other than to cook tissue. And he's saying that there's no physics mechanism that could explain how the field gets detected. If the field's not detected, it can't do anything. If your body hasn't detected it, it doesn't know it's there, then it can't do anything. If the light signal doesn't enter your eye, you can't tell that the thing that the light bounced off of is there. The energy's got to get into the body and trigger a response. He's saying, other than heat, it can't trigger any response. That's not true. And I demonstrated the existence of a physical mechanism, published it in a famous journal. That's as far as I could go. I can't take it any farther. Don't want to take it any farther. If that's not enough to falsify his hypothesis, then that's your problem, not mine. I met my goal. I met my standard. So the statement you were just making was a denial at two levels, the mechanistic level and the experimental level. Both levels were wrong. I demonstrated both levels were wrong by providing experimental evidence and theoretical evidence. I'm done. It's up to somebody else to follow on.
Right. Well, yeah, and I know he just goes marching forward with this exponential tech. And, you know, if you put out a Tesla car fire, if a Tesla car has a fire, it takes 140 gallons a minute for like an hour and a half. And then the water runoff, the effect it has on the environment, things like that. But yet it's the biggest push to make this the new green vehicle that's so good for the environment. But no one ever looks at all the unintended consequences of all these technological so-called progresses.
That's an important issue. That's an entirely different issue than one we were talking about. That's
Yeah,
another reason to not do research, to not satisfy ourselves by not doing research, to keep our eyes, to see no evil, hear no evil, and believe no evil. There are many other sources of evil regarding blinding ourselves to biological consequences. I was only talking about the most basic and the original ones. There's a million after that.
yeah,
But if they don't get resolved, you see no reason to resolve them. All the other ones aren't going to be resolved.
right.
Once it was decided that electromagnetic energy can't have any effects, then the epidemiological research that showed that children who live near power lines, high voltage power lines, have a higher incidence of childhood cancer. Once that was published, it set off fireworks. The government commissioned a $50 million program to do research to find out if it was true. Most of the money went to industry employees or industry contractors. They did experiments, and their experiments showed that that couldn't happen. There was no way it could cause cancer. So the government then asked the National Academy of Science to impanel a committee. The committee reviewed everything and concluded that the results of the study showed that it couldn't happen. It couldn't cause cancer. And of the $50 million, I wound up with about almost $1 million of those dollars, a little less than $1 million of those dollars for research. And I was the only guy who did experiments that showed that the energy had biological effects. Everybody else tried to do experiments and found effects and couldn't find any.
Wow.
That's the way the world
Unbelievable.
goes.
Yeah. And I remember you mentioning also the problem of like a primary care physician who's the least paid and most overworked, busiest guy, who's going to see the people that do have the ailments that are caused from the environmental harms. And now he's supposed to be the one that, or she, dissects it and figures it out.
Now you even before recognizing that the original problems weren't solved, then we got to the back to their exaggerations of the original problems, and then the problems kept getting worse and worse and worse, and the ignorance level kept getting worse and worse and worse. All that's going on. Now we're even farther into ignorance. How in the world will a clinician who knows zero about research? A clinician is a guy who goes to medical school. Now, a guy in medical school studies basic science his first year. He studies basic physiology, basic biochemistry, basic anatomy, basic physiology, basic pharmacology. And then he's done studying science. Everything else is clinical experience for 3 years. And then he's graduated, and now he's treating people. He knows nothing about research. How the hell? And now, so unless somebody has done research and shows him from research what to do, he's certainly not going to learn it in medical school because he never studied in medical school, because no medical school teaches it, because there's no research for them to teach. Do you understand how far away this poor physician is from knowledge? I mean, it's so, the patient who's got hypersensitivity might as well go ask a kindergarten student for advice as asking his physician. They just don't know because it just hasn't been studied.
Right. Can you explain a little bit about hypersensitivity syndrome? Is that what you call it?
Well, I can tell you that people began complaining about the syndrome. They said it existed. They said, this guy is allergic to milk proteins. This guy is allergic to peanuts. Well, I'm allergic to electromagnetic energy. That was the complaint. And I got bombarded with requests to conduct studies about whether there was such a thing as hypersensitivity, because not everybody is complaining about cell phones, and not everybody is complaining about being affected by being allergic to the electromagnetic power lines. They were special people. And year after year after year, I refused to get into studies because a multitude of reasons. I did nothing about it. But then a physician complained to me about it and agreed to come from where she lived and become a student, become an experiment, a controlled experiment, in which I would determine whether, in fact, she was electrosensitive. Controlled experiment. So she came to the United States, and over a period of time, I designed a study, got approval of the institutional's Human Experimentation Committee, of which I was the founder and former chairman. Got their approval. I'm off the committee at this point. Got her informed consent, did an experiment, showed that, in fact, she had the ability to detect these very, very, very weak electromagnetic signals of the type produced by cell phones. Wrote the paper, published the paper, and the paper concluded that there was such a thing as a hypersensitivity syndrome. I just proved it. I didn't prove how it came about. I didn't develop a mechanism for detecting it for a clinician. The experimental method I used detected it, but a clinician can't do it. My experiment cost, when all said and done, I estimate about $500,000. That one experiment.
Wow.
$500,000. Let me say that again. About $500,000. So how is it? You can see the impossibility of what you suggested.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the unfortunate part, is that it's the small individual people that have to prove that they're being harmed by the issue, and not the other way around, where you should have to prove that your technology is safe or your medicine is safe before you put it out to the masses and test it on the public. Same problem.
Why? Because the prevalence of Schwann's thermal criterion for the existence of a phenomenon. If the phenomenon doesn't exist, then it can't cause hypersensitivity. They nipped it at the bud. That's the way industry spends its money for research. They spend their money funding people who agree in advance to find no effects, or agree in advance, design an experiment to falsify an experiment in which I found a positive effect, or agree in advance to fail to do anything other than cast doubt on the affirmative evidence supporting the existence of health risks from exposure.
Right. And, have you ever really looked into the idea of how much money has went into from the CIA back in the 1960s and all the distraction that they have created for the masses? You ever got into any of that? You probably didn't have time for it, but
I have no way of doing it.
yeah,
The government, under a number of FOI requests, have provided a lot of information of what has happened. But anybody who tries to analyze that and come to some conclusion about something bad that was done by government employees, well, I would say good luck.
yeah,
So I don't waste my time trying.
right. We can just see that there's a massive amount of effort there.
And the implications are enormous. But
Right.
they're nothing more than implications, and the evidence needed to get beyond just implications and be more dispositive. That has highlights. Well, I can tell you what happened to it because a witness testified under oath before Congress. He destroyed it. It was destroyed.
Right.
It does not exist. The testimony that it does not exist exists, but the evidence does not exist.
Right. Yep.
Don't try to do the impossible.
Well, what do you want to say about Milton Zarrett? Is that his name? And his work, because I read about that in your book, but I'd love for people that are not going to read the book, maybe just to hear a little synapse of what happened there, because that seems very fascinating, that as a part of this thread.
Hell of a nice guy, highly educated ophthalmologist, a great patriot. He was at in Hawaii in 1941 when the Japanese attacked. He was there. He was on a ship that was hit. He had an interest in science from his practice profits. He began doing some experiments on the effects of microwave energy on the induction of defects in the cornea. Found those defects, published the work in ophthalmologic journals, and the world came down on top of him. He had a bad end, just like Becker, and he like Becker was not a businessman. Lacked the tools to defend himself, like Becker. But Becker's only tool for defending himself was me. And so Milton came to a bad end, as did everybody who opposed the inexorable development of the use of man-made electromagnetic energy in the environment, irrespective of its impact on human health. That became the rule. That is the rule. That will remain the rule throughout this century, I predict. But I'm hopeful it will change in the next century.
Hmm. And with Zarrett, he was basically saying that the embassy was attacked with EMFs as a weapon, and that people were being affected and getting sick from it, and it was some sort of attack from Russia or...
What we know from released FOIs is that in 1966 or thereabouts, what's taking place today in Havana began. The local government, Cuba today, Russia then, began bombarding the U.S. Embassy with electromagnetic energy. And strange things happened to embassy employees. In the beginning, they took no cognizance of it. They're not concerned. They didn't like it. But the American government didn't complain because the level of this bombardment, I won't go into the units, I'll just use numbers, was 18. We know from the data released under FOI. At that time, we know that the level for human exposure in Russia was 1. And we know that the level for human exposure at that time, because of Schwann, was 10,000. So America couldn't complain that 18 was a health risk when it was tolerating 10,000 for its innocent public population. So they said nothing.
Wow.
But over a period of the year, 1965 to 1967, over that period, employees at the library, at the embassy started complaining about various diseases. And although the data is somewhat difficult to interpret, it seems to suggest that of 4 embassy ambassadors that had their offices in the 8th floor of the embassy during the period of irradiation, 3 of them developed cancer. That alerted American officials to the possibility that this energy was doing something. Their concern was that it was scrambling the rational activities of the people, causing the ambassadors to make false judgments. That's really was their concern. So they hired people to do experiments with animals to see if it affected this level they were putting there, not Schwann's level of 10,000. That had to be safe by definition. What about the level of 18, or even 15, or even 13, or even 9, because the level was fluctuating? What about the safety of that level? So they put animals in that level of exposure, and the animals included rabbits, rats. They were asked to report the results, and the reports by the investigators, one of which was Zaret, who measured the effects on eyes, and Ross 80, who measured the effects on the brain. Both reported effects. That's where the information flow stopped.
Yeah. That's incredible. And then you just wonder where it evolves to today, especially with the more advancements that they have. But wow, that's pretty wild. I would love for you to maybe, if you're open to it, talk about your dream of Einstein.
The one I described in my book, you mean?
Yeah.
He appeared to me in the dream, and I described the dream, and the gist of the description was that Einstein was lamenting that he had gone as far as a human mind could go in explaining the nature of the laws that govern inanimate reality. He and I'll say Maxwell, who came before him, he and 2 other physicists had already discovered all the laws that are needed to explain everything we see. And once you can explain everything you see, the law, physics ends. There's only technology, applied physics. Physics itself, as it search for new laws, is over. He regretted and he lamented that no one picked up the cudgel and continued the quest to determine about the laws of biology. They just plain stopped. It's wrong. It represents an arbitrary, self-imposed, unnecessary limitation. But physics and physicists were fat, dumb, and happy at that point. This is post-World War II. They were ruling the world. They were developing bombs. They had all the money they needed. They didn't need the problems of biology, and they didn't tackle the problems of biology. And he was sorry about that. He was too old to do anything. They should have done it, and they didn't. That's the gist.
Yeah. I really enjoyed reading that part, and it was really inspiring too, because it's like biology is the more complex and mysterious and interesting place to look, because that's what we are, that's the world we're made of.
More complex. That's the understatement of all understatements. Physics is doo-doo, to use an explanation of a metaphor of some comic whose name escapes me, is doo-doo compared to biology. The laws of biology are incredibly complex, and I'll tell you why. It's because they depend. The laws can't be obtained by reductive experimentation. Living things depend on the constant influx of energy into them. If they do not have a constant influx of energy, they die and become just like a rock. They become something dead. If plants didn't have a constant influx of energy from the sun, there'd be no plants. If humans didn't have a constant influx of food, there'd be no humans and animals. Unless we get energy from the sun, energy from the food, there's no such thing as life. Living things are the only things that require the influx of energy to exist. Nothing else in nature does. So the laws that govern this nonlinear, chaotic, energy-consuming reality are incredibly complex and have never been attempted by physicists who in the beginning had no reason to and now have no resources to.
It's fascinating. Yeah, the living world is a big mystery. And I even remember you just saying that uncertainty is the most real, and that I really appreciated that about you, because it's the most true thing, is that it's uncertain. The mystery is where it's at. But I have a question for you that I ask everyone, and it's, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world? What would your message be?
Exactly what I just said today. Nothing more, nothing less.
I love that.
I can't do any further. That's why I was happy to do this. I could see this coming from the way you told me you wanted to approach this interview. I think you did a stellar job, and I knew good things were going to come, and good things, as far as I'm concerned, have come.
I appreciate you, and I really do respect you a lot. I look up to you, and it's just been an honor to sit here with you and to listen to your story, and I'll share it with as many people as I can. So thank you.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.